This is Chris Hodgkins bringing you Jazz and Dr. Johnson. This show was recorded live at Scarborough Literature Festival, and in the first half you'll hear Alison Rayner on double bass, Max Britton on guitar, Diane McLaughlin on alto saxophone, and myself, Chris Hodgkins, on trumpet. You'll also hear the voice of Sue Sheridan, who developed and wrote the script. I hope you enjoy it.
I think music is the least disagreeable. That was Dr. Johnson's considered opinion of music. He thought music was frivolous. What he would have made of tonight's music we cannot know. Jazz, as we know it, didn't appear until 150 years after his death. But let's imagine that tonight, in this very room, he might be sitting here alongside you and finding it less than disagreeable. That we have the thoughts and opinions of Samuel Johnson at all is due to the extraordinary and painstaking work of James Boswell, the son of a laird from Auchinleck in Scotland. He doggedly recorded everything Johnson said in his biography, The Life of Dr. Johnson, so that one can almost hear Johnson speak. As a troubled teenager at home in Scotland, Boswell had read and admired Johnson's writings in the magazine The Rambler. He confessed to finding great comfort and reassurance in what he called Johnson's commonsensical writings. Johnson was his hero, and Boswell was longing to meet this admired author. In 1763, his wish would come true. But the meeting was not as Boswell would have wished. He was at Thomas Davies' bookshop in Covent Garden, taking tea, when the great man appeared through the doorway. Boswell's diary for Monday the 16th of May 1763 tells the story. I drank tea at Thomas Davies' bookshop in Russell Street at about 7 o'clock. In came the great Mr. Samuel Johnson, whom I've so long wished to see. Mr. Davies introduced me to him. As I knew his mortal antipathy at the Scotch, I cried to Davies, "Don't tell him where I come from." However, he said, "Oh, from Scotland." Said I, "Oh, Mr. Johnson, indeed I come from Scotland, but I cannot help it." "Sir," replied he, "that, I find, is what a very great many of your countrymen cannot help." In spite of his Scottishness, and in spite of a 30-year age gap, young Boswell and Samuel Johnson became firm friends. Apart from a literary connection, they had something else in common. They both suffered from severe depression. Boswell had had a nervous breakdown when he was only 16 years old. Johnson discovered his condition during his year at Oxford University. He called it a morbid disposition of body and mind, a genetic condition inherited, it would seem, from his father, and one which would affect him all his life. University had been a mixed bag of experiences. On the one hand, that heady experience of a newfound freedom combined with a love of learning. On the other hand, perpetual, unrelenting, debilitating poverty. As Boswell says, he was depressed by poverty and irritated by disease. Johnson had been a sickly baby, suffering bizarre treatments that left physical facial scars. He was partly blind, and now at 20 he was long, lanky, ungainly and awkward, and poor. Now at Oxford he became aware of class discrimination, which gave him a disregard for authority, as he himself put it, and a hatred of snobbery. He was, in fact, an 18th century student rebel. "I was miserably poor, and I thought to fight my way by my literature and my wit, so I disregarded all power and all authority." As Boswell wrote, the morbid melancholy which was lurking in his condition gathered such strength in his 20th year as to afflict him in a dreadful manner. He felt himself overwhelmed with a horrible hypochondria, perpetual irritation, and with a gloom and despair which made existence misery, most miserably melancholy. Johnson left university after only 13 months without a degree. He received his honorary doctorate once his dictionary had been published and he became famous as a literary figure. But at the time, life post-university was tough. The transition, he said, from the protection of others to our own conduct is a very awful point of human existence, he wrote 45 years later. However, he did seem to fall in love and surprised his friends by marrying a woman 20 years older than himself, Elizabeth Porter. Through marriage to Tetty, as he called her, and with some earnings from teaching in local schools, he had enough money now to found his own school, Edgell Academy, in 1736. But failing to get enough pupils, and with only 3 boarders and a handful of day pupils, the whole enterprise was a disaster. And this made his relationship with Tetty very difficult. Boswell would later write, "He did not appear to have been profoundly reverenced by his pupils. His oddities of manner and uncouth gesticulations could not but be the subject of merriment to them. And in particular the young rogues used to listen at the door of his bedchamber and peep through the keyhole, that they might turn into ridicule his tumultuous and awkward fondness for Mrs. Johnson." But one of those ridiculing rogues would turn out to be a lifelong friend and the most famous Shakespearean actor of the day, David Garrick. Later, Garrick would help Johnson put on his only play, Irene, at the Drury Lane Theatre, where sadly it only lasted for 9 days. But on the 2nd of March, back in 1737, with one horse between them so that one rode while the other one walked, this curious couple set off from Lichfield, leaving Tetty and the unfortunate Edgell Academy behind. 27-year-old Samuel Johnson and his star pupil, David Garrick, now 18, were on their way to find fame and fortune in London. Having always occupied himself with the composition of verse, Johnson now set to work as a hack journalist in and around Fleet Street. Johnson loved this area, he loved his metropolis, he loved London's wonderful immensity, as he called it, with its population then of 600,000. "You must not be satisfied with seeing its great streets and squares," he said, "but must survey the innumerable little lanes and courts. It is not in the showy evolutions of buildings, but in the multiplicity of human habitations which are crowded together, that the wonderful immensity of London consists." Nowhere was more convivial to Johnson than his favourite taverns. He called the tavern chair the throne of human felicity, and nowhere would have been more convivial to him than the Cask Inn in Scarborough. But his favourite tavern was, where he preferred to sit, was in Gerrard Street in Soho, the Turk's Head. The Turk's Head in 1764, Johnson founded a literary club that would meet every Monday to practice the art of conversation. Members of this literary club included the great artist Joshua Reynolds, whose portraits of Johnson are legendary, Oliver Goldsmith, who Johnson saved from jail by getting his Vicar of Wakefield published for him, Edmund Burke, the Whig politician known as the father of conservatism, Charles Burney, and David Garrick. Burney was a musician and historian whose daughter Fanny became a great friend of Johnson's in later years. Johnson's relationship with his ex-pupil David Garrick was a curious one. He was always rather scathing about Garrick's talent as an actor, not caring for what he called his artificial tone and measured cadence in the declamation of the theatre. But still, he regularly attended all his plays. Indeed, he wrote the prologue for the opening night of Garrick's management at Drury Lane Theatre, Ode to Drury Lane Theatre on dedicating a building and erecting a statue to Shakespeare, thus helping to raise the theatre-going public's consciousness about the resurgent playwright William Shakespeare, whose plays had been much used and abused by the Restoration Theatre some 30 years previously. Drury Lane became a shrine to Shakespeare, as did Garrick's Temple at his own home in Hampton, and thus Johnson had helped promote Shakespeare to the household name he is today. After he wrote his treatise on Shakespeare, Edmund Malone, a Shakespeare scholar and friend of Johnson's, stated that Johnson's vigorous and comprehensive understanding threw more light on this author than all his predecessors had done. Now, Boswell was always close by, recording everything. In discussions, Johnson always wanted to win an argument, whatever the subject, and rather like a latter-day Stephen Fry, he made it his business to know something about almost everything, from making gunpowder to thatching. He united a most logical head with a fertile imagination, which gave him an extraordinary advantage in arguing. Somebody complained, "There's no arguing with Johnson. When his pistol misses fire, he knocks you down with the butt end of it." There were still financial constraints, however. Dr. Johnson's fortunes only began to change when, in 1746, he was commissioned to write a dictionary. It took 9 years to complete, and with the help of his 6 scriveners, he trawled through copious tomes, reading, researching, and referencing over 40,000 words. without the aid of a computer. He became known affectionately as Dictionary Johnson. Johnson's dictionary was a resounding success. He brought order to the chaos of language. Publication of this work on the 15th of April 1755 changed his fortune. Recognition and even a measure of wealth would now come his way. But, as with most things in Johnson's life, even success was not without its problems. His relationship with his patron led to this extraordinary letter of irony to Lord Chesterfield, known today as one of history's most spectacular public snubs. 7 years have passed, my lord, since I waited in your outward rooms, or was repulsed from your door, during which time I have been pushing on my work through difficulties, of which it is useless to complain, and have brought it at last to the verge of publication without one act of assistance, one word of encouragement, or one smile of favour. Such treatment I did not expect, for I never had a patron before. Is not a patron, my lord, one who looks with unconcern on a man struggling for life in the water, and when he has reached ground, encumbers him with help? The notice which you have been pleased to take of my labours, had it been early, had been kind, but it has been delayed till I am indifferent and cannot enjoy it, till I am solitary and cannot impart it, till I am known and do not want it. Literary patronage would never be the same again in this country. The dictionary was a landmark of 18th century literature. He created a kind of giant database, an 18th century search engine. Johnson had recognised that language derives its meaning from the way it's used, and he chose to illustrate each word with examples taken from literature. Philip Sidney, Shakespeare, Francis Bacon, as well as later writers like Dryden and his friend Goldsmith. Although he later regretted it, he wasn't averse to adding a few rather over-personalised explanations to his chosen words, as in, patron, commonly a wretch who supports with insolence and is paid with flattery. Dedication, a servile address to a patron. Lexicographer, a harmless drudge. Even more amusing to us was his way of simply transposing a word if he could find no decent explanation for it. Foot licker, a slave, an humble fawner, one who licks the foot. And then there are the words where the explanation obfuscates the meaning. Network, anything reticulated or desiccated at equal distances with interstices between the intersections. And then come the innumerable unusual words: bed presser, fat-witted, flasher, fop-doodle, fustillarian, kixie-wixie, alicadarian, gulosity, and muckender. Now, the explanation for muckender is handkerchief. For thy dull fancy a muckender is fit to wipe the slobberings of thy sloppy wit. And while we mull over this lexicographical masterpiece, we'll take a break and we'll continue this varied and extraordinary complex life of Dictionary Johnson in 20 minutes.